the many faces of loss and how to resolve it.
Right.
I do have one question before we begin. I know you and Connie Rae were spending time with Milton Erickson near his death. You went to visit him a couple of times. Did this in any way come out of Erickson's work?
Well, Connie Rae went twice. I only went once. I wasn't really able to track what he was doing, so I got bored. And every once in a while he'd pull a miracle out of the hat, but I wasn't learning anything that I knew about.
Uh-huh.
And in terms of relating to Erickson's work, we developed a method for resolving loss back in about 25 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
What I've done is I've researched Erickson's cases on depression in Bill O'Hanlon's book, Uncommon Case Book, just to see to what extent I can verify that loss was involved in the various clients that he saw. So basically, I'll explore the different kinds of, well, the summary says it probably better than I can say it myself. There's the actual loss, there's the loss of a dream, there's loss of other things, locations, information. So there are many different aspects of loss that many people may not be aware of.
Okay, so it's not always about death.
It's not always about a person.
Because ages ago I read this, what was it, My Voice Will Go With You by Sidney Rosen.
Right.
And there was this comment that he made about Erickson where Erickson said there's a lot of hogwash going around about assisting families in grieving. And that to me fits with what you're doing. It's not about grieving per se, but about remembering positive aspects of what was lost or what's still with you.
Right.
So.
Well, it's about resolving grief. A lot of people think that they have this, what they call grief work. And what they mean is crying your heart out forever and ever and ever. And that's no resolution there. It's just exploring, expressing the feelings, which has a certain value at a certain time. I'm going to talk today mostly about unipolar depression, not bipolar, because I don't know much about bipolar depression. I have a couple of ideas that I may throw in, but mostly I'm going to talk about unipolar depression. And my position is going to be that it's always in response to some kind of loss. Sometimes it's very clear. Someone dies and their husband or wife goes into grief and depression and so on. And that's going to be my basic idea. And what I've done is I've looked through Bill O'Hanlon's book, Uncommon Case Book, and I pulled out 12 examples of where he was working with depression to see if his work backs up my basic position or not. And if not, why not?
Okay, cool. Depression as a response to some type of loss.
Right. And the first example is very clear. It's called Case of Cynthia. A woman got married fairly soon after she got severe arthritis. Doctors told her she really shouldn't have a baby. She wanted, above all things, to get pregnant and have a child. She saw Milton Erickson. He said, look, this is the most important thing to you. It may not be possible to have a normal delivery. The child might be born dead, but it's the most important thing for you. Go ahead and get pregnant. And so she did, and she loved being pregnant, the 9 months of being pregnant. The baby, she loved the baby, and at 6 months, it was a crib death. And they said, you really shouldn't have another child. You shouldn't get pregnant again. She went into suicidal depression. They had to keep knives away from her and so on and so on. And Erickson basically said, and he did this quite often, he says, I think you're being very stupid. And his commentary is saying, I wanted to get her attention. And then he said, you had 9 months of happiness carrying the baby. You had 6 months of happiness caring for the baby. And you want to throw that all away? I think you should treasure it, and I'll tell you how to treasure it. And then he told her to plant a eucalyptus tree, a fast-growing tree that does well in Arizona. This was down in Phoenix. And so that you can look forward to resting in the shade of Cynthia, and you can rest in the shade of Cynthia. Now, this is a way of reassociating with the beautiful, wonderful experiences she had. Dr. Seuss put it this way, don't cry because it's over, smile because it happened. We're all going to experience losses. And the most interesting thing about this case actually is that there's a preamble to it, that before she got pregnant, she was very, very depressed because she got this arthritis and the doctors all told her it wouldn't be wise to get pregnant. She was suicidal then, not because she lost the baby, but because she lost her dream of a baby.
Mm-hmm.
There's several messages here. One is it's not the situation and external reality that causes the problem. It's the way the person represents it internally that makes the problem. And a lot of people realize that so much of loss is loss of a dream, loss of a treasured experience that they hope to have, but never actually had. And somebody can grieve just as hard or maybe harder for an idealized dream than they can over their actual reality.
So there's some type of future, and that future is gone, and they're grieving it. Or you're helping them reassociate to it somehow.
Right. That's the key process that my wife and I developed years ago. And one way of leading into it is you have some people that are very special to you.
Mm-hmm.
And probably they're not present in the room with you right now.
No.
But if you think of them, how do you think of them?
I'm in my office right now, and I'm just thinking of her when we were visiting in the back part of the house.
Okay, so she's close by?
Uh-huh.
Can you think of someone who's far away?
Yes.
Okay, if you think of that person, where are they in relation to your body and your personal space?
Well, hang on. So this is someone that I'm still close to?
Yeah.
Okay. It's a little weird, but they're in another country,
Yeah.
but I can imagine them sort of being right here with me, going down to get a coffee, because we used to spend a lot of time just chatting at coffee shops.
Exactly. They're life size.
Mm-hmm.
You could reach out and touch them.
Sure.
Well, that's the experience we're going for in terms of the loss. That you don't know your friend is in another country. They could have been hit by a bus yesterday and you don't know about it yet.
Okay.
And yet you can represent them as present with you, and you can have all the good feelings that you have with that person. And that's the goal in the grief resolution process, to take what someone is experiencing, the loss of a special person. Usually when people are grieving, they're experiencing the lost person as very, very far away, or as ghost-like, as transparent, or there's a dent in the bed, or they see themselves with the person, but they're far away, so they don't have the good feelings they had with them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the experience that causes the tears and the grief. So the overall goal is to take that image of that person that's far away and distant and untouchable and unreachable, and represent them in the same way that you represent your friend, is right there with you, life size and so on. Some people like to represent the lost person in their heart. One person represented like a cloak over them, so that the lost person that they were still connected with was like a cloak or a heavy overcoat, embracing them gently and keeping them warm. So there are variations on how people do this. Part of the work is to find out, how does a person represent the lost person? Where in their personal space? Is it over here? Is it over here? Is it up? Is it down? Is it far away? Is it panoramic? And so on.
Okay.
Find out the details, because then you find out exactly how they're representing the grief now, the lost person. And then you find out how they represent someone who is present to them, like your friend, so that they can actually talk to them. And right there, so you gesture a little to your left. For instance, someone else might gesture to their right. When I think about Connie Rae's in Europe right now, and when I think of her, she's always at my left side. Mm-hmm. I don't know why, but that fits for me.
Just the way it is.
It's just the way it is. If I can find out how it is for a particular person, then I can give them instructions that will fit for them perfectly. Maybe for no one else on the planet, but it will fit for them perfectly.
So it's really nice because, in preparation for talking with you today, I read the grief resolution process. You have it on your website. I'll give the link to people. I've been to some, years ago, been to some of your NLP trainings. But in that moment when you asked me to think of the person who's far away, that's, I still feel is very close to me, I had this kind of flush, and I felt really good, and it was nice. I just know he's close to me, and somehow thinking about where he is, and it just somehow amplified it a bit.
What we're dealing with here are unconscious parameters of experience. Most people, if you walk down the street and said, "Can you think of a good friend?" they'd say, "Yeah, I can think of a good friend," but they'd have no idea where in space they represent them, how far away, whether the image was a movie or a still, life-size or small, and so on. Those are all unconscious parameters. Now, someone who's grieving thinks, well, they're gone, I have to feel sad. And they don't realize that there are plenty of people that they've enjoyed in their life that when they think about, they don't feel sad. And if they really can't find one of those examples, I can do what I did with you, is say, think of someone who's special to you, but isn't present close by to you.
Very nice.
And find exactly those conscious parameters that make it possible for them to feel that contact and the loving feelings that they had and all the rest of it.
So now you're saying that these submodality changes and these type of inner experience changes were happening with Erickson when he was doing his work in these cases of depression, or I guess maybe in the cases that Bill was doing. You're saying these changes sort of were part of the process, happened as a part of the change work he was doing and that Bill was doing?
I would really hesitate to mind read Erickson. I really don't know what he knew and how much he knew. I know he knew something about submodalities, but how much he knew, I don't know. What I do know is that in this particular example with Cynthia, he did the right thing of having her reassociate with the wonderful experiences that she had with the baby as a way to pull her out of the depression, because she was just thinking of the death and so on. And that's another point. When somebody's lost, a lot of people don't remember the good times. And what they call grief is actually more like a phobia or PTSD. They remember the death, or they remember the cancer, or they remember the horrible fight and the breakup and stuff like that. They remember the end of the relationship rather than the good things that they miss. And so it's important, kind of right at the beginning, to say, tell me a little bit about your picture. What are you representing inside? And if they say, well, it's the fight or the breakup or the cancer or whatever, you say, look, that's not what you missed. What you missed was the good times. What you missed was the love, the spontaneity, or the steadfastness, or all the qualities that you had with that person. I want you to change that picture to one of the good times when everything was going well. I'm sure there were bad times too, or times when they were annoying. But think of one of the good times, because that's what you miss. You don't miss the annoying part. Just last March, I presented at the Networker, and I wanted to demonstrate this process. 2 women came up in succession, and it turned out both of them were remembering the end of the relationship. And when I told them to change to the good times of the relationship, that's all that was necessary, actually, to go through the rest of the process at all. Because as soon as I said change to think of one of the good times, it all came back to them right away, associated into the good times, and they were done. Which has got to qualify as briefest therapy.
And so you found this pattern in other case studies that you recently reviewed in Bill's book, Uncommon Casebook?
Yeah, there's another one that's very similar in a way, and I'll keep it fairly short. But a woman had been paralyzed for 10 years. She was a PhD grad student. She came to Erickson with a request, a very clear request. She says, either I want a philosophy of life that makes me willing to go on, or I want a justification to commit suicide. And he worked with her in a lot of very interesting ways. She ended up marrying a medical doctor, a pathologist. She was paralyzed from the waist down. She was incontinent for both urine and feces. And basically, Erickson built a future for her. He started out by, I guess I will tell some details. He had her go through the National Geographic and the encyclopedia and look at the funny-looking women that men will marry. And the variety of women that men can find attractive and so on. So he built a little opening of hope, just a little window of hope, that maybe she could find someone. And then he did a lot of other work with transferring orgasms from the vagina to the breasts to the earlobes, to various other parts of her body.
Mm-hmm.
And he interviewed her 10 years later when she was married and had four kids, I think. And
Whoa.
she had orgasms. She had sex 4 or 5 times a week. And she described in detail how she had them around her lips and her earlobes and her breasts and so on and all this stuff. So he built a future for her. And there are a number of situations where he built a future for people. In a number of the cases. There were 12 cases that I found, and I think in at least 3 or 4 of them, he essentially built a future. Now, there are a lot of ways of building a future, too, that most people don't realize. Everybody has a sense of time, and most people, either their future is in front of them and their past is behind them, or their future is to their left and their future is to the right.
Mm-hmm.
Now, sometimes people have an end to their timeline, that literally it ends, sometimes very close. And you can actually extend the timeline and then fill it in with pictures of what they could do or what they might be willing to do or what they could be interested in doing. So that's another way of building a future. And with one client who had a very, really nasty past and living in a boarding house, a poor job, and no relationships and so on, he started out by reviewing his past in crystal balls, which is something he often did. Now, the nice thing about a crystal ball is it's essentially dissociated. You're seeing yourself in the crystal ball, reviewing your past. So it's a way of reviewing your past without getting a lot of emotion out of it. It's a more or less a Dr. Spock kind of review of the past, of all the things that happened and so on. And then he gradually then used crystal balls into the future as well. First with just very little modest changes. And one of the things Erickson did was he introduced very modest little changes. Just some kind of little change that might seem totally irrelevant. One of the cases was a guy who was an industrialist who had lost everything. You know, lost all his money, lost his house, lost his wife, and so on. And he was in a psychotic depression in a mental hospital, and he was rubbing his hands together like this. Mm-hmm. And Erickson, the first thing he did was he said, "Oh, now you're a guy who's really had your ups and downs." And he gradually had him move his hands up and down like this. A very small change. Now, that might seem a ridiculous change to try to induce in a guy with psychotic depression, but it was a very small window, a very small start to then making further changes. Mm-hmm. What he did was he strapped sandpaper to the guy's hands, put a piece of wood in a vise, and had him sand the wood. And initially he did it just listlessly, sanding the wood because there was a piece of board in between his hands. And then he gradually got interested in the wood and making it nice and really smooth. And then he ended up doing things in the wood shop and so on, and eventually got released. So there's a situation where it was clearly a loss, an actual loss. That he'd had all this money, he'd had all this influence and so on, and then he lost it all completely.
Interesting. And then, so he had a loss, and then he helped the guy build some type of a future. Well, I guess he helped the guy get involved sort of in the present moment, just doing something, anything.
Yeah, it's just a beginning to recreate, because he's in a psychotic depression. What are you going to do? You can't really talk to him yet. You first got to get him engaged in the present moment, get him into the present so that you can then do more with him. A friend of mine, their NLP trainer, Ed Reese, did a home visit on a psychotic depression. A woman was sitting on the edge of her bed, not responding to anybody. And he tried all the stuff he could think of, and he has a lot of flexibility and a lot of skills. Finally, he went into the bathroom, got a paper cup full of warm water, put it behind his back, walked around, stood up on top of the bed, "Well, you really are a piece of shit," unzipped his fly, and very gently trickled a little bit of warm water down her back. Now, she came out swinging. She was pissed. And, being pissed is not a cure, but it's a start. She was engaged. He got a response from her, and then he could utilize that response.
Well, I find those examples very motivating, but as you were... The other example with Erickson, just You know, sometimes we have this idea of Erickson as the miracle worker and he does all these amazing things, but you know, when we're in front of someone, sometimes we just want to start with something very small. What's something that we can do to get this person moving in a particular direction? And I don't know, I just find that very motivating somehow.
One of Erickson's saying that has been in the forefront of my mind for the last, I don't know how many years since I've discovered it through a friend, is your task is that of adjusting, not abolishing. Make a change, but don't try to wipe out anything. And I think I have yet to find an example that violates that. Want to make changes.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's also, I don't work too much doing hands-on Feldenkrais work anymore, but for many years I did. And Feldenkrais back in the 90s when I was learning it was sort of the therapy of last resort. No one had heard of it. And, you know, they'd see their physical therapist, their doctor, and their massage therapist. And before giving up, they thought, well, give this weird Feldenkrais stuff a chance. And I was always, in the beginning, I was very intimidated because these people would come to me with really big problems. They had been in car wrecks. They could hardly move. But it was somehow paradoxical in the sense that the more limited someone's movement was, the more pain they had, the easier it was actually to make a difference, to just make a subtle adjustment that would give them some space to breathe or to move. And so perhaps it's similar with Erickson's work.
Yeah. Let me use another example. There was one young man, he was in his mid-20s or something like that. He was in college full-time. He had a full-time job in the evenings. And he loved to do music on weekends. He played in a band on weekends. And he was hired because he clearly had talent, but he had so little time to practice that he wasn't developing his talent. His boss said that he was going to have to fire him if he didn't, develop more. So there it's clearly an impending loss that he was depressed. And in this case, Erickson just did straight-ahead problem solving. There wasn't an internal image to deal with. There wasn't an actual loss to deal with. There wasn't an internal conflict or anything else. It was just a practical problem that he didn't have time to practice. So he taught him time distortion and taught him that in his evening job on breaks and a little time when he didn't have anything he actually had to do, he was pausing between jobs or something like that, use time distortion and imagine practicing his music. And he improved, and then he kept his job. So this is just a matter of simple problem solving. Many people wouldn't call it therapy, but it got the job done.
That has uses for a lot of things.
Sometimes it's just a simple thing that somebody needs. Another example from Erickson is the African Violet Queen. Do you know that story?
Yep.
Well, just very briefly, a former client said, I've got an aunt who's depressed. She lives alone, and she's in Milwaukee. I want you to go see her. So he went to see her, and there was this dingy old house. She was independently wealthy. She had a maid come in and a gardener and so on, but she didn't interact with anybody. The house was all gloomy. But he found out that she went to church every Sunday, and he also found out that she grew African violets. And he picked on these two things as whether there was some energy, there was something that could be developed. First, he accused her of being not a very good Christian.
So more of that attention getting, like you're not a very good Christian, just to sort of...
Well, it's partly attention getting and it's partly motivating. She thought she was a good Christian. She wanted to be a good Christian.
Okay.
So being accused of being a poor Christian, and what he meant by that was she would enter the church just before the sermon. She would leave just before it ended. She never talked to anybody. She never interacted with anybody and so on. And he talked about Christianity being about giving and serving and interacting with other people and so on like that. And then he instructed her to raise African violets and then give them away every time there was a birth or a christening or a marriage or a death. And she became what is known as the African Violet Queen. And by doing this, she re-engaged her with a future. So he essentially built a future for her, created a future in which she would be interacting with other people. Now, she didn't have like a sudden loss, but she had an empty life. She had a life that had no future, that had no essentially no relationships with other people. So he built it for her.
Very nice.
I've got my examples on little cards here.
That works for me.
There are the two of Erickson's examples were women who had internal conflicts that basically erased their future or made their future bleak. And that's another thing. People often talk about the future looks black, or I have no future, or there is no future. I talked earlier a little bit about just straight ahead building a future. What could you do tomorrow? Again, starting very small. What could you do differently tomorrow that would make you feel a little bit different when you wake up in the morning? Or what could you do in the afternoon that's different than what you usually do? One of these women had found out that her best friend was having an affair with her father. Well, is there a loss there? I would say there is, because she didn't like it at all. It wasn't appropriate as far as she was concerned. One way you could think about it is she was faced with either losing her friend or her father, or maybe both. She would lose her idealized image of her father, whatever happened, and she ended up breaking up with her friend.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this conflict was about, what do I do in this situation? Whatever I do, it's between a rock and a hard place. Either way, I lose something. And the other example of this was a woman who was raised by a very moralistic mother who told her to not let boys do anything to her and so on. Her mother died when she was 13 and she didn't get to update this information. And she fell in love, and when the guy tried to kiss her, she vomited all over him. Which was actually didn't slow him down, but she refused to see him again. So it was an internal conflict between an early childhood admonition or injunction and natural, wanting to have a relationship and have children and marriage and so on.
All right.
So in those cases, he worked on working on the conflict inside. So what I'm trying to do here is build a picture of there's many kinds of losses, and I'll go into that in more detail too. But loss is the key thing, and then what is causing the loss? Is it a practical thing like this musician where he just couldn't find the time to practice to do better? Is it an actual loss? Is it a phantom loss or a loss of a dream, in which case you need to do the grief process and so on? With loss as the major focus, then what are the parameters that are causing the loss or threatening the loss? And what's the most efficient way of dealing with that? And that's where I think Erickson really shone. I really don't know how much he knew about submodalities, but he was immensely practical. He would get the job done the most efficient and effective way in the shortest period of time. With the African Violet Queen, he only saw her once.
Mm-hmm.
When she grew her violets, and the rest was just the result of the instructions that he'd given her. And when she died, 900 people showed up at her funeral.
Mm-hmm. So that's interesting, because when I was doing some reading just to sort of get prepared to talk to you, I read the grief resolution process, and I was really thinking of it as in terms of death and dying. But yeah, there's all kinds of different losses. How do you make the decision to employ the grief process or to do something else?
Basically, if there's an internal representation of something that has been lost, with the young man in the music, it was an impending thing that he might lose it. Now, if he was told that he could never play again or something like that, or if he'd injured his hand so he could no longer play guitar, then the grief process. So that leads into the other thing about different kinds of losses. You can lose a person, and that's what most people think about. You can also lose an activity. I'm almost 80 now, and there are a lot of things I can't do anymore. One of them is skiing. My balance is so bad now that sometimes I get up out of a chair and I sort of stagger around. I haven't fallen yet, but I stagger around. Skiing is totally out of the question now. Besides, I've got low energy as well. But I can still ski in my mind, and I can still feel the snow on my cheeks and the wind on my cheeks as I go down the hill and jump over jumps and carve those turns and so on. So activity is another one. Location is another one. I'm a real location person. I love to have a particular place to live, have everything in its place where I know where it is. location is important. Someone who loses a house or is forced to flee a country and loses a whole culture, they may lose relationships, they may lose location, they may lose information, they may lose their native language. There are many, many different kinds of losses. There are basically 5 different categories. I've already mentioned person, location, activity, information, and things. People lose things. For some people, losing a diamond ring is worse than losing a human being. And you need to notice, you need to give respect to this, because it'd be easy if you're a really person-oriented person, and someone came to you for therapy and they're all fussing about how they lost a diamond ring, you might think, oh, that's ridiculous. But for them, it can be just as bad. And for an athlete who loses his ability to play a sport, it can be just as bad as losing a human being in a relationship. Now, there's another aspect of loss, and that is that there's a loss of self. If a woman loses a child, she also loses her sense of self as a mother. If a sports guy loses an ability to play a sport, it isn't just losing the sport, it's losing the status that he might have had, the skill that he might have had, his self-concept of being an able person. So there's also the sense of self that's involved very often. And it's good to be aware of that and respect that. And it's a way of building rapport, if nothing else. You can say, oh, yeah, it must have been hard for you to realize that you're no longer capable in that way, or blah, 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 whatever. It's something they may not have even thought about.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, this is great, because it's really expanding my ideas of what you've been teaching and what the possibilities are. You know, I spent many years in Utah, which is kind of like where you are in Colorado. There's the outdoor life everywhere. I could be in a canyon in 20 minutes, and there's mountain biking, these deep forests, and to the south was the desert. And after a few years of living in Mexico, I'm in the very southern tip of Mexico, where there's beach and there's a little bit of outdoor life, but I realized after a couple of years that something wasn't right in my life. I was feeling kind of disconnected, and I was missing the rivers and the desert and the forest. And I remember just sitting back in my chair back behind here and just sort of trying to bring those experiences up, remember them, and think about planning a trip, etc. And I went out and actually bought a mountain bike. There's not any mountains around here. But over the course of a few weeks, I was able to find some trails out here and sort of find what nature I have here and bring it into my life. So I guess that would be kind of an example of a geographic shift. We change to a new area.
Well, it's also a nice example of finding something that interests you and sending it out into the future and re-engaging in the present and the future.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and actually I haven't taken any trips back to Utah or back to some of the nature up around. There's a city called Puebla that's got a lot of mountains, but it's out there, right? It's just a matter of we'll launch this conference, take a few days off, and
yeah. So
it's created a bit of a future to pull some, interesting.
Well, one of my gripes with a lot of let me back up a little bit. Back in the 70s, I was part of the now generation, be in the now, be in the here and now. And now it's called mindfulness and being in the present moment. And there's certainly something to be said for that, particularly if you have a future that looks really bleak, just to step back and feel your body and feel the present moment. But a lot of life is living into the future, and it can be overdone. Somebody can decide on a wonderful future and then lose their life for years trying to achieve it and so on. So there can be an imbalance in that way. But on the other hand, a lot of our satisfactions are in what we're hoping for, what we're working toward. And can even save your life. There's a story of Viktor Frankl where he's in this concentration camp and going on a work detail in the snow, and he stumbles and falls to his knees, and the guard pokes him with the muzzle of his rifle and says, "Get up or I'll shoot you." And he flashed on being 5 or 10 years in the future, having survived the concentration camp, giving a lecture to a bunch of people on Man's Search for Meaning, which was the book that he had already written, was taken away, and then he tried to rewrite on little scraps of toilet paper and things like that while he was in the concentration camp. And that gave him the strength to get up off his knees and continue. So sometimes the future is really important. And if you have no future at all, it's not nice.
No, that's brutal. No, that's brutal.
Not nice at all. And a lot of people have that. And if you can help them build a little bit of the future. There's a piece in the grief resolution process, since it's written up and you're going to give the thing, I won't go through it in gory detail. But there's a piece at the end, after the person has reassociated into the loved experience, whatever it is, having the thing or the activity or the person with them so that they can re-experience that fully in the present moment. Then what you do is you take the qualities of that experience, make an image of the qualities, and then you make a separate image of how you could exercise those qualities in your present life. And you take that image, it's a future image, and it's fairly vague. You don't know quite how it will happen or when it will happen. You make it glow, and then you multiply it into a deck of cards, different cards, each of which is a little bit different. And then you cast them out into your future. And what happens, especially if people have their eyes closed, is these little glowing dots of light go out into the future, and some are fairly close, and some are mid-ground, and some are in the farther future. But they're like little beacons that lead the person out into the future. So it's taking whatever's valuable to them and throwing it out into their future, so that if they had particular warmth and closeness with the lost person, they can think about how they could have warmth and closeness with other people in the future. And it's a way of bridging from the past to the present into the future. That's one of the things Erickson was always doing, going from the past into the present into the future. Most people are, when they're in difficulties, are oriented toward the past, or they have no future. And to reorient them into the future is a huge intervention.
Yeah, very much so. Okay, so someone comes into our office, they're sad, depressed, maybe we find some type of loss that they've had, and we kind of bring in the positive qualities of things before the loss, you know, the good parts of the relationship, the good parts of the...
Whatever the image is. Let me give another example that hopefully will also broaden the scope of this thing, because that's the major thing I want to get across here, is that the sense of loss is a unifying principle that you can find in many, many different ways. A woman came up to me ahead of time and said, I had an abusive childhood. When it feels like I lost the childhood that I could have had, is that something you could work with? And I thought about it for a while, and I said, what's your image of your childhood? And she had a very, very vivid image of mother sitting in the chair, she's sitting on the floor, her head is in her mother's lap, the mother is stroking her hair, and so on. And I said, sure, it'll work, because she had that image. She never had the experience, but she had the image of the experience. And that's what's driving people. It's the image inside, not the reality. And so I worked with it, and I heard back from her later. She was, like many people, she worked with abused people, and she did it with all her clients. She would elicit the idealized image of what they missed out on, and then give it back to them. Once I did this with a friend's wife, I did this process with her, and my friend was watching and observing, and he says, I see. She lost a part of herself, and you gave it back to her.
See, this is fascinating, because I have sort of a cognitive idea of what that would be like, but not the experiential base. So let's just say I feel a sense of loss, perhaps. There were things that I wanted to have happen, or qualities to have happen with my parents that I didn't have. But if I have an image of how I wanted things to be, you could help me sort of bring that image in and make it real. And does that change my past? Does it change the sense of my past?
It gives you an alternate past. And there's a famous example from Erickson called the February Man. Where a woman had a very deprived childhood, cold mother, and distant business father. And he visited her as the February Man and interspersed experiences before or after a birthday, before or after some particular time in her life. So it didn't interfere with her real life, her real experiences and her real memories, but he spliced things in. Most of us, in fact, all of us, as far as I know, we don't have a totally continuous past. There are gaps. There are times when nothing much is going on. Well, it's another day like yesterday. And he would splice in experiences in there that gave her the sense of being loved and wanted and understood so that she could be a good mother to her child, because she was planning to have a child. And she knew that she would be a bad mother because she didn't know what a good mother was. And he spent a lot of time with her building experiences of what it is to be parented so that she could then use that as a basis for parenting her own child. Erickson was tremendously creative.
Well, so were you and the people that you work with. I mean, you're doing stuff here that, I mean, you're making a lot of patterns explicit and making, anyway, yeah. I feel like I'm in a trance right now, kind of thinking about the possibilities. So I think I've had an experience of what you're talking about where I've, you know, don't want to talk about myself too much here, but I want to kind of bring the experiential aspects in for people. You know, I had not talked to my father for quite some time, and when he got sick and he died, I had been traveling. I was unreachable. And so This whole process, you know, my father got sick, he died, and the funeral, and I, you know, wasn't around. And at one point when I was reading through your grief process, I had this idea that, you know, I had, since my father had died, he was very upset when I dropped out of college, right? And he's like, oh, it's a big deal for him. He was really upset, angry. And since then, I finished college, gotten a master's degree, taken some other post-grad training. And I don't know how or why, but I was working with your grief process, reading through it, and I just kind of imagined an old situation where we had argued about me not having my degree. And I was telling him, hey, man, you know, I got my bachelor's degree, I got my master's, and I remember him feeling getting this idea that he was very happy about that. And somehow it was just like a traumatic memory kind of fell away. I mean, I know it's not real per se, but it feels real.
Well, here's the thing. Your father was not real. But here's the important thing. What's important is your image of your father, just as what's important is the image of the loss. What you did was you made peace with a part of yourself. Your father probably didn't know anything about what you did in your mind. But you did, and your image of your father did. And whenever we're angry at somebody or have difficulties with somebody in our mind, it's like our brain gets separated a little bit. There's the me, and then there's the person I'm having trouble with. There's a disjunction there. There's a separation. And by doing this kind of internal dialogue in experience with full visualization and feeling, essentially healing split within yourself.
Now, every time you said something about the image of my father, I immediately went over here to where the image of my friend is that we talked about in the beginning of the session. My friend who's far away, who feels very present to me. And then you said it again. As far as you're concerned, the image of your father, and then I went over there. So, I mean, obviously, I'm in on the game because I know a lot about the process, but I can see how it's helping me associate into some positive images. Some positive experiences.
Thank you.
So is there more that we need to cover here? Are there more examples that you have?
Well, there's probably something in here, but I don't think it's that important. Oh, maybe one other thing. Long ago, there used to be an idea that depression was anger turned inwards.
Yeah, I remember that.
And I haven't heard much about that recently, and I think probably that's a good thing. I don't think it's anger turned inwards. I think sometimes someone can be in conflict and be angry at somebody and result in depression because it cuts off their future or because it eliminates a possibility in the present that they'd hoped for and looked forward to. But I don't think the depression, anger turned inwards, makes a lot of sense.
No, and I don't think too many people experiencing this presentation, or Ericksonians in general, would believe that.
I don't think so, but it was something I jotted down.
They'll leave a comment under the presentation. I may get back to you with comments that people leave.
Well, even if somebody believes that, I think perhaps I could adjust their belief a little bit. If I'm angry at myself, it's not really me that's angry at myself. It's an introjected part of somebody else. It's like a parent, like you talked about your father was angry with. That's a part that you introjected and became part of yourself. You remembered that he was angry with you, so it became a part of yourself. And so that means that it's like an internal conflict that needs to be resolved. Well, you did resolve it already, but if somebody had that and had not resolved it, there was an internal division that needed some resolution.
Can we talk for just a couple more minutes about one piece of your presentation, or one kind of the loss, which is sort of the loss of self? Or so things like, someone comes into our office and they've just been through a divorce and they're feeling the loss of that relationship. Let's say they've dropped out of graduate school, so there's a career perhaps that's not going to materialize.
Sure, there could be lots of different losses.
So,
and to validate and acknowledge all of them.
Mm-hmm.
See, someone might come in and say, just be focused on the divorce and loss of the spouse. And you can say, that must have been difficult for you to give up your dream of what you were going to have with her.
And so then do we associate them to the positive qualities of that relationship that they had before the breakup?
And well, here's another important distinction to make. Sometimes a loss is traumatic. Someone's in a car accident and dies. Mm-hmm. The other person is with them in the car and they don't die. What you need to do then is be very, very careful and separate out the method of the death and the loss of the relationship from the relationship itself. The traumatic experience of the loss of the relationship, you have to deal with using the phobia procedure, the VK dissociation. And the grief is just the opposite. And if you don't separate them out, the more you try to deal with the phobia or the traumatic situation, the worse the grief gets. If you try and work with the grief, the worse the trauma gets, because they're exact opposites. In trauma, you're remembering a horrible experience associated in being inside it.
Mm-hmm. You need some distance.
And in grief, you're remembering a wonderful experience, but from a distance. Mm-hmm. So they're exactly opposite structurally. And you have to do opposite things. With the trauma, you need to get the distance from it so that you can see it like Dr. Spock. Mm-hmm. And you need to reassociate and bring it in so that you have the positive experience. The basic idea is that good things and bad things happen to us through life. Some people get the raw short end of the stick and get a lot of bad stuff and not so much good stuff. But either way, whatever the balance is in a particular person's life, they may as well dissociate from the bad stuff so that they don't have to have all the bad feelings, and associate into the good stuff so that they can have those as resourceful feelings to go forward into the world.
Mm-hmm.
The future.
Okay. I think that was the piece that I was somehow looking for, consciously or otherwise. So in the sense of someone just going through a relationship, you can help them, or we can help them associate to the positive parts of that relationship, the feelings, the ideas, the qualities that they want to have in the future, and sort of disassociate from perhaps the negative qualities or the things they didn't like about the relationship.
Yeah, once I demonstrated this at the social work conference, and a guy came up and his wife had died of cancer, and the last 6 months were up and down and chemotherapy. They made really good use of it. They reminisced about old times together and all the enjoyment they'd had during their marriage and so on, but it was interspersed. There was good time and bad time, good time and bad time. So I had him go into a film editing booth and just go through all the movies of those 6 months and sort out all the good stuff went on one side, all the bad stuff went on one side, and got those all sorted out. And once I got it all sorted out, did the phobia procedure on the bad stuff and the grief procedure on the good stuff. It's often important to sort things out because there's a lot of different factors going on. If you don't sort things out, it can be really a muddle and be hard to accomplish anything.
Great. Yeah, I encourage people watching this presentation to go to the link. I think if they just type in Steve Andreas grief, process, they'll come to it, but I'll put the link as well, to grab that, print it out, and go through the process a few times with friends, with colleagues. Feel free to start with something subtle or
Fairly mild.
I found it very accessible, very easy to do, and a great learning experience.
Most people have no objections to resolving grief. The easy way to find it is go to steveandreas.com and then search for articles and then grief.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably the quickest way, since they can't click on a link.
I think they should be able to click on it. So we've been going for about an hour.
Well, maybe it's time to wrap up.
So can we talk for like 2 or 3 minutes about objections?
Well, some people will say,
And if people want to get up and stretch, they can do that, huh?
I'll say, some people will say, well, you know, if I'm with the person, that might get in the way of my future relationships. And it turns out that it's exactly backwards.
Mm-hmm.
That by having a sense of what it is like to be in a loving relationship, it gives you a template or gives you a goal to strive for in meeting new people and recreating that relationship with somebody else.
Okay.
Sometimes people will say, these are very rare that people have objections, but there are a few. Sometimes people will say, if people knew I was going around with my dead wife at my side all the time, they'd think I was nuts. Well, just don't tell them.
Yeah.
Other people, like if someone's from a Middle Eastern culture where you're supposed to grieve for a year or wear black for a year or something like that, then if you don't, then other people will, you don't fit in with the culture. Okay, well, you can have the sense of being with this person so that you know that you're not grieving. But I'm sure you know, look mopey and put your head down and wear black, and you can go through the motions of satisfying the culture while at the same time inside feeling resourceful and so on. So there are a few little objections like this, but mostly they're not that strong. I want to mention one other thing. If somebody has some objection or some hesitancy, you can say, talk to your son and ask him, how would he like to be remembered? Ask him that and find out what he says. And I have never yet found anybody who says, I want you to remember me crying and weeping and moaning and groaning. They all say, I want you to remember the good times. And you don't have to put words in their mouth.
Yeah, that's very powerful.
It is. It's a very simple little piece, but it's very powerful. And there's another good one, too. There are all these little tricks or these little pieces. If someone has some hesitation, you can say, you know about amnesia, right? Where you forget everything? Now, if I could give you amnesia for ever having known your son, for ever having known your spouse, would you accept that?
Oof. No, that's painful even just to think about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's, you know, everybody always instantly answers yes. But it builds a picture, it builds an unconscious image of, oh my God, yes. And then you can ratify that and say, yes, of course, that was a wonderful experience. It would be terrible to lose it, just as Erickson did with the example of the woman who lost her baby. It'd be terrible to throw that experience away. But it's a real punchy way of getting that across. Would you accept amnesia? No one ever has accepted, has ever said yes.
I feel physically revulsed at that idea, even with some sort of painful relationships I've had. Like, to totally block them out would somehow seem like numbing or cutting off some part of myself, which I don't want.
And you can amplify that too, and because in any relationship, not only you discover things about the other person, but you discover things about yourself. Your own ability to care, your own ability to be all the loving things that you did in response to the other person. Those are parts of yourself. That's the self part of the loss that often people lose. When they lose the relationship with the other person, they also lose a sense of themselves as a loving, caring person, able to be humorous and spontaneous. And so whatever qualities were brought out in you by that relationship.
And, you know, we haven't talked specifically really about hypnosis, like hypnotic language patterns and that type of thing, but they're everywhere in what you're doing. There's presuppositions about time and experiences, and I just kind of want to point that out for people that are listening. I mean, it's very what you're doing is very hypnotic, but we're not necessarily saying, you know, go into a trance.
No, I've been watching some Erickson videos. that are fairly recently released. In one of them, he says, hypnosis by itself, almost word for word, hypnosis by itself doesn't do anything. Hypnosis is a way of creating a positive climate for doing other things. Now, my emphasis is on what do you do after hypnosis, or what do you do after someone's in trance. Personally, the most thought I ever put someone in trance is they close their eyes. But on the other hand, a lot of the things that I do are trancey. A lot of when I do the thing about, would you accept amnesia? That builds a picture for the person of losing all the wonderful things. That's essentially a trance. It's a very motivating trance. And you talked about being revulsed. You had an unconscious response to that image. It was very powerful for you.
Yeah, and being deeply involved in some future possibility, some future state, that's trance, very much. Michael Yapko says that a lot, too. He's like, hypnosis is a powerful amplifier, but it's not therapy, in his opinion, or not necessarily change work.
I think amplifier is a good word.
Yeah.
Good word. It can help people focus attention. I think all therapy and change is a matter of shifting attention from one thing to another, looking at things in a different way. Yeah. And trance can help that, but personally I find I can do pretty much everything I need to do without any official trance. But I don't work with some of the difficult people that Erickson worked with either.
Right.
So there are probably people that I can't work with very well because I don't use trance.
Yeah, maybe. I'm not so sure I'd agree with that. But my consciousness has definitely been shifted as we've talked and as I go into thinking about my friend, thinking about the future, and thinking about these various possibilities. So it's definitely been hypnotic for me, and I'm guessing for some of the other people.
Well, another way of talking about hypnosis is that any time you use words, you're doing hypnosis.
Yeah. I remember that from somewhere. Bandler, Grindler, I don't know.
Well, I think it's in the book Transformations. Anytime you're interacting with somebody, the words are a way of conveying experience, ideally. Unfortunately, a lot of therapy is involved in describing experience rather than creating experience. But hypnotic language is about creating experience.
Yeah.
I think Frida Fromm-Reichmann said a long time ago, back in the 40s, people don't come for experience. Unfortunately, most therapy I see, it's all explanations and almost no experience at all. In fact, it mostly puts me to sleep.
Well, Ericksonians and Erickson in general, it's all about creating new experiences for people.
Even the crude hypnosis is about, at least relaxation. It's an instruction. It's an injunctive language. Paul Václavic talked long ago about injunctive language versus descriptive language. Descriptive language is you're this way because of your parents and your genes and you're this, that, and the other. That's describing things. Injunctive language is try this out and find out what happens. And hypnosis is all injunctive language. Let's do that.
Well, I have to admit I'm full at this point, so I'm not going to be able to understand what you just said until I put this online and review the video a couple days from now.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. I'm pleased.
I appreciate you doing this. I'm glad. I think it was 2 years ago that we did this last time, so I hope we can keep doing it. It's very, very valuable, in my opinion.
I'll do my best to stick around, and thank you for your participation in this.
Thank you.